Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice is a very, very polarising film. Some would argue this is the film that killed the DCEU. I'd agree. This is the point which all the problems start to emanate from. You have WB scrambling to sort of create a product that rivals the MCU in a very haphazard way. A lot of reactionary studio interference. I think it's probably their biggest failure in the sense that obviously it made money, but you have two of the biggest superheroes of all time. In fact, the two biggest superheroes of all time. It's the first time they're on the big screen together in live action, and the film didn't crack $1 billion. Not to say that, you know, box office is the be all and end all of whether a film is good or not, but I think it is very telling in a time that was the height of the superhero movie craze, the comic book movie craze, that this film didn't manage to crack $1 billion. I think that speaks volumes. It's an interesting one because I find myself revisiting this film a lot, and I will categorically say I think this is a bad film. I would say I hate it, but I do find myself watching it again and again. I think partially that is due to the fact that just in general I love the world of DC. There aren't many modern films that have these characters in live action, so this is all I get. So I'm kind of like a crack fiend. I know that it's no good, I know that it's been stepped on, but I need my fix. So I don't want to just rag on this film for the whole time I'm talking about it. So let me start with the things that I thought were really great. Visually it's very, very appealing. I think the costume design is fantastic. Then as a cinematographer, I think Zack Snyder is, very, very good at his job. I don't think he necessarily gets these characters, but I think visually, when it comes to visuals, he has a particular talent and an eye for things that, is undeniable. Hans Zimmer does a great job with the score. There's lots of spine-tingling pieces of music in this film. It's epic, it's grandiose, it's perfect. I think the first sequence where we see the Battle of Metropolis through Bruce Wayne's eyes is fantastic. I think that's a great idea, great way to introduce the character. It's during the day, he doesn't have any equipment, he doesn't have his suit. We'll see that Bruce's main thing is helping people. We see he wants to save people in his building. So we get that idea that, this is a heroic Batman, which is then kind of completely dismantled throughout the rest of the film. I think the main issue of this film is they tried to pack too much into it. The themes it tries to deal with, the allegory, the illusions, and even though the extended edition has a 3-hour runtime, it's just not enough time to unpack these things in a meaningful way. And on top of that, a lot of characters are portrayed in a way that is very, very different than their comic book counterparts, which again is fine. Adaptations don't have to be one for one from comic books. But I'd also argue that a lot of these portrayals don't actually fit the film's intended purpose for these characters either. There's a sort of callous way in which supporting characters are viewed in this movie. If we bring it back to Man of Steel, Emil Hamilton and Guardian are both killed off. In the beginning of this film, Jimmy Olsen is killed off in a pretty unceremonious way before he's even met Superman. And for a character like Superman, who can be physically harmed but for the most part is going to be invulnerable in many situations, his supporting cast will fill a very particular role. They're the vehicle through which you can introduce peril, tension, drama, levity. Things happen to them, Superman reacts. If you kill these characters off, you're kind of cutting your feet before you can even walk. This is Superman that's very early on in his career and he hasn't created any of these relationships with these characters. And before there's even the opportunity to explore those relationships, they're killed. So you could argue that, comic books are monthly serials, they function a bit differently, there's decades of content they can reference, films are slightly different. But if this was intended to be a universe similar to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Superman's eventually going to go back to his own franchise and need people to interact with. Other than Lois and his mum, who else is he going to speak to? Who else is he going to have relationships with? Obviously there's still Perry at the planet, but there's nothing in these movies that tells me that Zack Snyder wouldn't be happy killing Perry White off at some point. Similarly, with Batman, we see a Robin suit in his cave, suggesting that a Robin has died, but according to Zack Snyder, this was Dick Grayson rather than Jason Todd. And again, if you kill off the first Robin that Batman has, what incentive does he have to then go out and recruit another partner? Rather, that would make him retreat even more into himself, leaving the only person for him to interact with being Alfred. And again, we lose something there. Beyond his relationship with his Rogues Gallery, a big part of Batman is his relationship with his Bat family. And if you've sort of cut the root of that family before it's even had the opportunity to exist, what are we doing here? What are we creating? I think another example of someone being mischaracterized and not utilized to their full potential in this film is Lex Luthor. Luthor's one of those characters for me who's never really got his big screen justice. We've only seen one version up until now, which was the Donner version played by multiple actors. And he's not really the ruthless tycoon or the mad scientist that we're used to. He's someone that surrounds himself with people that aren't as smart as him, so that he feels like he's smarter than he actually is, and sort of is very obsessed with real estate and land, and uses the same tactics again and again to get at Superman. So that wasn't a very interesting take on the character in my opinion. I think Michael Rosenbaum in Smallville does a much better job, and the animated series did a great job of showing someone turning from a ruthless tycoon into that sort of mad scientist role. And initially, when I saw Jesse Eisenberg was cast, after seeing him in The Social Network, I was actually quite interested to see the type of thing he'd bring to Lex Luthor. And yeah, the reality wasn't really all that. It's sort of like a very strange take on the character. He's very manic to the point of where it's like, how does he manage day to day? Does he really run this company? What's his motivations? Is he jealous of Superman? Is he xenophobic? Like, you don't really get much of an idea. There's some illusion that he was abused by his father as a child, but in terms of his actual desire to, he's discovered Batman and Superman's identities, and his desire to actually make them butt heads. Where is this coming from? We never really get that answered in the film. In both the comic and the cartoon, there has been instances where aliens have interfered with Luthor's mind, specifically Brainiac, and force him to do certain things. I don't think that's the case here, because he doesn't really discover much about aliens until he gets into the Kryptonian ship. So we never really get a full idea of what's actually motivating him to do these things. We're told he's the mastermind behind these things, but we don't necessarily get to see that evil genius play out. And that's, I'd say it's a shame, because I think he's probably one of the best villains in all of DC. I think another area where the film falls down is the conflict itself. It's far too drawn out. The film is 3 hours long and we don't actually see the fight until the last quarter of it. The fight itself isn't that spectacular, the conflict there is pretty contrived, and the resolution even more so. The idea that Batman finally sees Superman's humanity because their mothers share the same name, it's silly. There's no other which way to look at it. It is pretty silly. Trying to adapt a comic like The Dark Knight Returns in the second installment of your universe is, I think, a bit crazy. That story isn't a typical superhero story. It's a deconstruction of the genre, of certain tropes. The idea that society's love for heroes, need for heroes, can lead to fascism. And you have very particular versions of each character. A Batman who's older, embittered, disillusioned, disenfranchised. A Superman who's become a puppet of the state. Very, very particular versions of these characters. So drawing from that material in this sort of superficial way does a huge disservice to this film and this universe which is trying to establish itself. For example, Batman's characterization. What makes him different from his enemies? If he's willing to brand people, making them a target in prison, gun down enemies indiscriminately, what makes him different from the Joker? What makes him different from Zsasz? What makes him different from Calendar Man or any of the other killers in his rogue gallery? This ideological battle that's meant to take place between these two characters is pretty weak, because through their actions they show they don't truly care for human life and are happy to kill in situations even when there are other options. With Batman in particular suggested this behaviour is out of the norm in one scene, but the reaction from his immediate supporting cast doesn't suggest that his actions step outside its usual boundaries. It's a real shame that the first live action interaction between these two iconic characters is given to us in a fashion that seems so counterintuitive. And I mean that not just in the sense that this is a far cry from their comic book counterparts, but even within the context of the action itself in this film, a lot of things don't really make sense. So in this scenario where Superman's in a race against time to save his mother, as soon as he lands in Gotham, rather than explaining the situation and what's going on to the person in front of him who he needs to reason with in order to resolve this situation, and reveal that Lex Luthor was the one behind all the shenanigans from the past year, he instead thinks it would be more prudent to throw him through a building. The film fails to answer any of the philosophical questions it puts forward. I think the most intriguing question among these is, what is Superman's purpose? And that's in a meta sense both within society and our world and what he means to us versus his actions within the film. I think the biggest issue is that the film looks at Superman purely as a symbol rather than a person. We don't get much introspection from Clark in Man of Steel or this film. And it's a real shame, because I think aesthetically Henry Cavill is a great Superman, but he's not given anything in the script that lets us actually get to know the character. In the first film, his father teaches him that it's better to hide than help people. And in this film, his mother says that he doesn't owe the world anything and can choose to go back to the shadows if things are getting too much. So if the Kents aren't the people that put this idea of self-actualization into young Clark Kent, what is the spur behind his desire to be Superman, this person that always tries to find a better way? There is none, other than his love for Lois Lane, which again feels very hollow, and I don't think that relationship is explored very well in Man of Steel or this movie, adapting the death of Superman this early on in this manner. The original event was only really done for the sake of brand synergy. They had to find a way to delay the marriage of Lois and Clark in the comic books until the TV show, The New Adventures of Superman, was able to catch up. So of course they had to kill him. But within the context of the story, you have a scenario where there's an unstoppable monster who's defeated the Justice League. Granted, this is a league made up of mostly C-listers like Bloodwind, Guy Gardner, Booster Gold, Fire, but nevertheless Superman is the only character with the abilities that's able to go toe-to-toe with this monster. And obviously in this context, Superman is a much beloved character with years and years of stories behind him. There's a very particular reaction to this heroic sacrifice. When you put it in this context where one, you amalgamate Zod and Doomsday, you take away Doomsday's one defining characteristic of looking cool, and you place it in the backdrop of a world where there is no Justice League, so Doomsday's unstoppable nature isn't fully depicted, and on top of that, this is a world that's very mistrusting of Superman, is very hateful towards him. Therefore, his death and demise in this fashion, especially where there is no crowd to watch, that heroic gesture, that sacrifice, means nothing. And the final folly of this film, the Justice League, is introduced through a series of short videos that Lex Luthor has collated. I can't think of a worse way to introduce these characters. This is the greatest superhero team of all time, and we're watching, found footage of them. It felt very shoehorned and lackluster, like a lot in this movie. But at the very least, I'm hoping that the new DCU learns from this movie's mistakes.